Еврейская вера, и так, и так, и так, надо рано уставать. Эх, люли, да люли, надо рано уставать. Эх, люли, да люли, надо рано уставать. Надо рано уставать, мой деяний засказать. Эх, люли, да люли, мой деяний засказать. Эх, люли, да люли, мой деяний засказать. Мой деяний засказать, негел вассер отливать. Эх, люли, да люли, негел вассер отливать. Эх, люли, да люли, негел вассер отливать.
All right, my name is Rabbi Mordechai Lightstone. It's a pleasure to have everyone here for our second 12X event, a series of 10 amazing talks over the course of 12 months, and I'm incredibly honored to have this esteemed panel with us this evening. Tonight's talk is called The Soul of Soviet Jewry, and it's something a bit afield from the normal topics that we speak about. Normally we talk about things about tech and media and, you know, the intersection between those things, and but obviously a healthy amount of Judaism mixed in. But this is, you know, when I spoke to some of the people involved with Tech Tribe, you know, so we truly like, yeah, it's interesting, but it's not a normal Tech Tribe thing. But I think it's very pertinent because there's a certain level of grit and tenacity that can be found with the Soviet Jews, not to stereotype everyone, whatever it is, that is very worth exploring. And beyond that, I'll just say that personally, it's always been interesting to me because my family left the Soviet Union in 1930, which is a bit of a weird time. It's, you know, it wasn't part of my family, came from Japan as well, but it's the last part that left Ukraine in 1930. It was a little bit late on the kind of the mass emigration of the 1880s, 1890s, 1910, whatever it is, and way too early for the other normal times as Jews actually left the Soviet Union, which has been a mystery that I'll have to figure out at some point. But in any event, I'm really honored to have our amazing speakers here tonight. I'll be facilitating a little bit, but they're very talented and can more than hold their own beyond whatever I have to add in. But I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Miriam. I've been a journalist for about 20 years now. I did most of my career in Russia, I guess. My family is originally from Russia. My mother left in the mid-70s when there was a big exodus of Jews from the Soviet Union when they were actually allowed to leave, and settled in New York. I'll keep it short there. We can kind of discuss the personal stuff later, but at this point, I quit my job 3 months ago, and I am freelancing and editing books and trying to find my purpose.
I'm Alex. I am a columnist at Forward. I was born in last Soviets born in the Soviet Union. We came over to the States in 1994, and I guess we'll get into family stuff later, but excited to be on this panel, especially with some folks whose work I've been reading and enjoying for a very long time.
Dovid Margolin, thank you for stereotyping us as tenacious and gritty. So we're going to take it. I'm an editor at Curated. My parents were, my parents came to the United States in 1985. They were refugee for a number of years, and maybe this is something that will, I write on Jewish topics in general, but kind of as I got older, I got more and more interested in the Soviet Jewish story, and I guess just the Soviet Jewish identity in general, and it's basically what I would prefer to be doing now, more than anything else. Writing that, anything else that I do is kind of just describe.
So I guess with the first question, a softball for everyone here, is I'd love to hear your family stories and kind of the stories that both express your general experience in the USSR, or like family, whatever it is, and as well the particular Jewish ways in which they express themselves. So start, I guess, with Alex.
For me, growing up, there's a kind of like a weird relationship to a lot of it. I was told stories about my family growing up that I didn't really understand. My mom would, talk about her grandparents and how they were talking in Yiddish, and they would do these strange things, and they would have meals separate from their children, and sometimes they would go off and go to Minsk, and they would get this strange bread, and her grandma would come over on Friday nights with this other strange bread, and sometimes they would light candles. And I didn't really understand a lot of this until I was in college and in an environment with a lot of observant Jews and encountering things like Shabbat, the Hive, and everything else that's starting to make sense of it. My mom is describing her experience with people who were observant well into the Soviet era. She was describing things from the 60s and 70s. And it started to dawn on me of, the religion is not something that other people were doing. It was a thing that my own family was doing. My dad would talk about the stories of, he would every spring go with his grandma and they would go around giving gifts to Jewish families in town. It got me on this journey of what does it mean to have this kind of heritage? What does it mean that we stopped doing it? Why did we stop doing it? I ended up just reading reams and reams of what the Soviet policy was and how it shaped the Jewish community that remained in the Soviet Union, and why my family was the way that it was. Also there.
So I guess this year, I can start with last year. My grandmother passed away at the age of 96. Close, very sad, but 96. And my grandmother came from a very, very, let's say, I don't want to say typically Soviet, because I would say everyone has their own family story, but came from a very, very Soviet background. Her uncle was, all of her uncles were members of the party. One of them, if anyone's familiar with Russian history, Kolchak, Admiral Kolchak, right? He was the leader of the white forces. So my grandma's uncle is one of the people who signed his death sentence as a member of the Bolshevik, the revolutionary committee in Irkutsk, Siberia. Which, when my grandfather, my mother's father, who's like a real shtetl Jew from Ukraine, when he heard that, he told my father, "Please do me a favor and never tell that to anybody ever again." So that was but my grandmother was born into the her father was a member of the party. I think he was just following his family's footsteps. But my they came from a very wealthy family in Irkutsk in Siberia, came to Moscow. So my grandma was born there in 1925 in a very, very, let's say, revolutionary, exciting in some ways time. It's more interesting, certainly, kind of culturally. But she grew up in an apartment a few blocks away from the Kremlin. It's on Bolshaya Lubyanka, or off Bolshaya Lubyanka. Very, very close to that place. And after she passed away, I was thinking, and I written about her. I interviewed her, thankfully. But kind of, to me, it was very interesting thinking about how she grew up without any Yiddish, actually. Her mother knew Yiddish, but even her father came from a more assimilated family already. So they were very, very in the Soviet experience already, very early on. And yet, 96 years later, my grandmother passed away. So first of all, she has, children who are observant Jews. She has grandchildren who are great-grandchildren who look very different from the childhood where that she was growing up. And more, my great-grandfather was my grandfather's father was arrested in 1938 and shot. And we didn't actually know his date of arrest for many, many years. I have spent some time Googling, and a number of years ago found memorials, lists of executed people. So found his actual date of death the first time. And so, fast forward 100 years later, from when my grandma was born, in the beginning of this whole experiment, which turns very bloody, and it's something that she experiences, very firsthand, coming already from an assimilated family. Forget about the fact that you cannot possibly learn more about Judaism, even if she knew where to turn. She had these kind of little glimpses of things, but much less than somebody who had nostalgia from the shtetl. She knew about things from Shalom Aleichem, from reading Shalom Aleichem, not from the Russian Shalom Aleichem, not Yiddish. And but fast forward 100 years, And she has this whole family, and my grandmother herself was somebody who, at the end of her life, she was, in the last 20, 30 years, she was already like fasting. Or she had a certain, and she would say, yeah, you did, or I don't believe, but she did all these types of, there was something that I would say that she, in many ways, she did much more than that. She was somebody who went through all that and felt and acted, I would say, very much as a Jew. And I think that's a fascinating story where you're coming from there and to the point where now she's, she's buried and in the Jewish cemetery, and on her gravestone is a memorial addition for her father, who up until this point didn't have any memorialization at all. So, from Stalin's abyss to this place, very, very Jewish endpoint. And I think that, in a way, kind of tells us a little bit of what's unique about the Soviet Jewish story, where a lot of people have similar stories where you don't even know why you're particularly Jewish or what that means, but it's still, that thread kind of means. So, answer whatever you have.
Very powerful. So I actually feel a lot of shame around answering this question because it's a huge sadness to me that I don't know deeply more about my family than I do. I tried to interview my grandmother, who passed away 3 years ago at the age of 99. I tried to interview her almost a dozen times. I went home with a notebook, with a dictaphone, and everything. And I think that the trauma was so intense that she buried it so far that she couldn't even talk about it. She lived through the bombing of Leningrad, the entire siege of Leningrad. Family lived in World War II. The family was evacuated to Novosibirsk. A lot of deep stuff there, and a lot of horrific stuff that the Russian army also visited on people who were taken out of Leningrad at the time, even on Russian Jewish civilians. But so I grew up in New York. Both of my parents came over in the mid-70s, and I grew up thinking that all Russians were Jews, because in New York, most Russians were Jews. And 2 weeks after college, I remember this was my first kind of Jewish awakening, because we grew up, I remember all the cool kids were doing Hebrew school. I begged my parents to let us do Hebrew school. Begged them to let us get bar mitzvah. They refused, even though they despised the Soviet Union with all their bodies. They could not bring themselves to be part of any institution, and I think that's one of the results of being a Soviet Jew. So 2 weeks after college, I moved to France. I remember talking to a friend on the metro and being like, "Oh yeah, I'm Jewish from New York." It's "You're Jewish from New York? Do you know Sharon?" And I was like, "These people don't understand anything. There are so many Jews there." And then moving to Russia as an American who always felt a little bit weird here because I had this entire Russian family, I moved to Russia thinking I was Russian to some degree. And it was my Russian friends who made me feel constantly that I was not Russian, I was a Jew. There's a different word in Russian for if you are Russian and if you're an ethnic minority Russian. And so my journey to Judaism started there. I actually sought out a rabbi in Moscow and was like, well, if everybody's calling me Jewish, and I was pretty old at this time already, it was late 20s. I was like, if everybody's calling me Jewish, I should probably figure out and own my own identity myself. So my family was very different. The Jewish traditions mattered a lot. We always celebrated holidays, but there was not an ounce of religion really anywhere. It was 100% through food. It was 90% through food and 10% through jokes. And for us, it was really entirely cultural, and no part of it was religious, despite the younger generation's attempts to try to bring some religion.
Grouping up all that, I had this experience. I was a camp counselor in Lithuania with Lithuanian Jewish kids. And the first mistake I made is I said, no, you're Lithuanian, I'm not Lithuanian. You're Russian. So that's what I'm Russian. I'm not Russian. I'm Jewish. And it was this very clear understanding, identity being split as ethnic identity, but there's something more to that as well. When I was speaking to a camp where we were speaking about Persian, it's one of the mitzvahs we do is a daily mitzvah, and one of them is a Persian, somewhat Jewish, it's possible. said, it means it's possible. She said, that guy's Brazilian, Georgian Jew, Georgian, not Jewish. He's never going to become, a Jew. That person's claiming, I'm a Jew, that's it. It was this, it ended up opening up my eyes to a very different way of understanding what it means to be Jewish. And that way, I think one of the primary strands of that is, the scope of the 20th century, in my mind, there have been three major, sectors of Jewish identity: the North American Jewish experience, which you can maybe, bagels, mosques, and talking about roast, whatever, everyone stereotyped that. And then you have an Israeli experience of, and Jews and IDF and whatever. And I think Russian Jewry represents a third major center of the type of Jewish identity, which I think the other two, which I think most of the room here says is really often, tend to be unaware of what it means. So I guess that's the great looking for you guys. What do you think makes the Soviet or Soviet Jewish identity to me different?
I think a lot to start with. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Soviet Jewry, so I can lay out some basic facts that you may not be familiar with. In the Soviet era, where ethnic identity is not something that was just a personal thing you could ID with, it was government dictation. So on my Soviet birth certificate shows that my nationality, Soviets uses this to prove ethnicity, Jewish, not Russian, not Belarusian, it's a Jew. And that was a marker that for people of the parent generation was social determinant of politics. It determined where you got to live, it determined what kinds of education opportunities you had, what kinds of career opportunities you had, what kinds of people would want to be socializing with, and how much contribution you get. And I would describe that in the American context, but ethnicity doesn't capture all of it. There's very much a racialized kind of component to it. Or hair, my dark features, all these things.
I know it's since I
were these things that people would not just notice, but they would treat differently for. Practically everybody I know of my parents' generation has stories of, they would be called up in school first day of class, teachers would single out who the Jews were, and that was an invitation for violence after school. Everybody in the form kind of experience. I don't know that was true everywhere in the Soviet Union, but it was absolutely true in Belarus as well. And those kind of things shape an understanding of Jewishness that is distinct and is different. To your point, I didn't grow up with a whole lot of people who went to 5 or every year my dad did kids for a nice house. That was the extent of my religious engagement growing up. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was a Jew, even if I couldn't explain what that meant to everyone else, because I lived in this social environment where it was people who were Jewish because of the violence and the discrimination they grew up. Where you go with that, you're no longer in that environment. It's, you're this kind of thing. When I was applying for college, I go to my college application, I said, there's a lot of Jews at this university, and I would like to be a part of the Jewish community. I got into my university. So it's a wildly different experience on the other side of it. But does that answer the question?
I think I chime in the sense that I think it's fascinating what you're saying about kind of identity being, let's say, beyond the descriptors, where it's very much based into who you are, and obviously that on many negative, there's a lot of negative aspects of that where people called out, where you're abused publicly, these are all things that all of our parents and grandparents lived through in various ways, depending on the decade and the time and place, but it always somehow showed up. On the other hand, there's also, let's say, I don't want to say a positive, but there's something which is greater that you see through that. I think that you see that a lot of time in kind of the expressions of Jewish identity within Russian Jews. Let's say matzah, I'll take that as an example. So matzah is like this basic staple that everybody, but it's a huge number of Russian Jews grew up with eating matzah, their grandma making it, and I've written a few times, and completely, very, very random people and different backgrounds, and their grandmother baked it in the oven, they bought it in the shul. I called my grandfather, actually, he was a real Jew, and he told me, he used to have the Leningrad, he's from Uman. My mother grew up in Leningrad, that's where he lived for 50 years. She said that in Leningrad, you have to come to the shul, you have to come to the synagogue with your rations, like your bread card or whatever, and you give it your bread card, and they give you matzah instead. So he said he used to paste on the other side, not to get his name on the list because there's any problems for names on the bottom. Anyway, but it's a very interesting thing that they don't know why they're doing it, and they're still doing it. Somebody knows, but not everybody does. I would say the vast majority of people have no idea why they're doing it, and they're just doing it. And in that same way, so I went back to the former Soviet Union, also being not first time there. I was born in America, grew up speaking Russian, but and kind of in the Russian environment of tea and herring, whatever. But when I got there, which I wasn't thrilled on going there originally, but I got there, I was like, wow, this is great, I love it here. And I get, but the Jews that we met there, not religious Jews necessarily. Again, I went to, I was a counselor in Moscow, I spent a year in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and now they're all different, but then it was all just former Soviet Jewry, right? And we speak to people, and they're Jewish because they're Jewish, and there's something very, very deep, very, very ingrained within that. And I think the matzah represents that in a way, but that's a very, very powerful thing. Where it's real strength is what I want to say. Is that you have, everybody's special, everybody has their own thing, but these descriptors, I'm like this, I'm like that, and they're like, I'm Jewish. Like, what are you gonna, it's not even an argument. And I think that has very, very powerful aspects to it, and I think it kind of really gets the word, soul, who they are, and obviously it has some negative ways that came out, but there's some real strengths that I think come out.
So one of the experiences of the Soviet Union was the way that anti-Semitism was very much institutionalized, as opposed to in America. Even you had anti-Semitism in the 1950s to the 1960s. My grandmother moved to California, and the neighbor, Montreal, Los Angeles, the neighbor saw I you in church, in a synagogue. It's funny where your horns. I mean, that's I'm sure so this days all over the world because these things never end. But the Soviet Union was very much part of the system, and so I think unfortunately so much of Jewish identity is built on the reaction to anti-Semitism, for better or for worse. But I'd be curious how you have thoughts about navigating the Jewish experience in the light that it has in the Soviet Union.
I can talk a bit about just what I've done for my family, I guess, which is I'll talk about my mother in particular, just carried such an acute fear of anti-Semitism, on the surface of her skin in a way that any other sort of fear never really affected her, and I think she saw it creeping around every corner. She and I would fight about politics all the time. There were certain things that we couldn't talk about. She would be one of those people who would just kind of look for it in every single thing. And I think that it was just very, very on the surface for her because of the experience that she had. It was a similar thing at school. We were coming and finding anti-Jewish chalk markings on the apartment building that she lived in. And I think, that's a beautiful story about the matzah. I think that for me, with my family, it's very hard to find positive stories actually going back. And there's a reason that most Russian Jews that you'll meet, I lived there from 2006 to 2013, so a fairly long time. And despite seeking them out, did not really meet that many Jews. And the people that I met that were Jewish were Orthodox. They were oh, we're Jewish, but our grandparents converted as a means of survival. There's a reason that you meet most of them outside of the country because it was so horrific that everybody who had a chance in the 70s fled, in 91, and then in 94 fled. Sorry, that was a bit rambling.
on anti-Semitism as part of Jewish stuff. I think for most people, for most Jews I know from the Soviet Union who are children of Jews from the Soviet Union, it is very much a large factor of their identity. I think to a degree it is for me too. Like you're talking about Iran, seeing things through the lens of like anti-Semitism. I can say I do that instinctively without even like thinking about it. You know, my wife would tell you like when we're going to travel, the things that I am looking for when we're going to somewhere in Europe is like, where's the ghetto or the pogroms? Like that's just instinctively where my head goes in terms of understanding the local issue. Doing like a tour of like the Colosseum, they're talking about like the design and everything, and I'm thinking about the Jewish slaves who were built. And that's just the way that I was taught to understand the world. It's not even something I have to make like a conscious effort to, you know, think about things through a different kind of lens. It's a hard thing to do, and I think when you're not thinking about it, when you're going through your daily life and you're just trying to make these kinds of, you know, associations and understanding the world, you come to see the world in a very distinct kind of way, and in a fearful kind of way. There's a lot of people who don't like you historically and presently, and that shapes how you socialize, how you understand events, how you respond as a political actor in various kinds of environments as well. And you know, it's something that stays with you. I don't think that it goes away that quickly. I think there's a lot of benefits to it too. Of you know, paranoia in an age of political instability is probably a helpful instinct in some ways, but there are downsides to it too. You're not mistrusting things. You know, my wife and I were just on we just got married. We're on a honeymoon, so I'm sure I'm saying my life a lot. You know, when we were you know, at a kosher restaurant on Shabbat, you know, big meals and whatever else, we sat down and there was this guy who sat next to us and started talking to us and started conversation. It was very interesting, and I was thinking about how if my parents were put into that same scenario, it's a room full of Jews, like as safe an environment as you're going to get. I know for a fact that my dad would have ignored him, and my mom would have politely said like 2 words to him, and they would have gone back to him because that's a stranger and you're in public and you have no idea who he is and whether you can trust him or not. That's just the way that they understand the world, and I think that. You know, you can call that like a trauma response, but you know, trauma plus time is culture, right?
But yeah, my father told me that right when they came in '85, they were, you know, early in the '80s when they were here. Said I hate a rule: you came to my house and you knocked on the door, and I didn't expect you. Like I'm not opening the door, and like it doesn't make a difference if it's like your friend and you know who that is. Like you didn't call before, like I'm not opening the door. Just as a knee-jerk reaction. And I think he told that to me, and then there was a knock on the door. And I was like, I'm opening it, it's America, and like went down, it was like the census, which you know, like, didn't help me with my point.
But I wanted to talk kind of the anti-Semitism part. I think it is very, very, very deep, and is very different than there's the small things that make up the whole experience. Because of course there's the anti-Semitism that, let's say, you know, all our parents and us, you know, ourselves, when we were growing up, and small things. Those are the kind of small experiences. Then there's the generation before that you know might have grown up with something you know, a little bit more tradition, where that was my grandfather was not a, you know, also now we're just mentioning all of our grandparents who passed away. He passed away 100 years ago. So if you have somebody at 101, you're gonna have to do. But he was 100, but we're pretty sure he BS'd it, and really he was 99, and he changed it. So like he stopped at 100. He made himself a big 100th birthday party. So my grandfather, I gave people advice on how to live a long life. He fell into the role. So he grew up at a very young age. He went to Cheder in Uma, and then all of a sudden I was done. The teacher was taken away. He didn't know if he was arrested. He said they were taking them away. They're arresting them. They were scared them out of their position. This is in the early 20s. And that's it. And so he, you know, spoke a beautiful literary Yiddish, you know, speak on Russian, you know, Yiddish radio shows in New Jersey. But he read at a second grade level. He read Hebrew at a second grade level. But that's where his Jewish education ended. So that's like a whole. So that's another level of trauma. And then there's their parents who really grew up, very often at least a very deeply Jewishly engaged life. Everyone was different, but they knew they had that option. They had that education. They had that even the culture, and that was all just completely torn away from them in a very violent way. So something interesting that I've been reading, that I was listening to Lubavitcher, and so Lubavitcher Rebbe was a Russian Jew, which is something that I always found fascinating. There's recordings of him speaking in Russian, which is as a Russian a very exciting and I find very very powerful. And so there's a conversation in the early 80s where, and it's a theme that Rebbe spoke about very often, but Rebbe would cry about Russian and would speak about it like in a way of great pain. And one of the things was, so you mentioned the different themes, but there's the famous story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which is in Tanakh, that these three, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, set up this idol in Dura, the Vale of Dura, I'm not sure what the Vale is, whatever, and he set up an idol there, and everyone had bowed to it, and there were three Jews who came from the Jewish royalty. The Jews were exiled at the time, and they didn't bow. So he ordered his men to throw Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah into the fire, and they went into the fire, and they were saved, and it was a big miracle. And this is considered to be like the ultimate self-sacrifice in Judaism. When you talk about what it means to sacrifice, what in Judaism in general, sacrifice for life, not that we're seeking to sacrifice our lives, but the person who's martyr, 6 million Jews of the Holocaust. This is like the ultimate category of this is it's everything. And Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are brought up as like this example, and the Rebbe speaks about them. He's speaking about there's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and it's such a tragic story, and that's self-sacrifice, but that's a self-sacrifice that's over in a minute, 10 minutes. It's something. It's a big event that takes place, and with Soviet Jewry, it's 50 years of non-stop, year after year, generation after generation of just complete suffocation of Jewish life. So I think it's almost unparalleled in I can't say for thousands of years of history, but if you think back, it's a very, very unique spot, in the last 1,000 years, certainly, of where you have 3 million Jews behind this Iron Curtain who are experiencing this, not little things, but like it's part of the big push, part of the big structure that's there to put you down, and then you still come out in that way as a Jew, that's something unique, and like you said, tenacious and the other gritty that you used, that was very good. And whatever the question was, but yeah, that's how it also affects. That sounds right.
Sure. So I think what's interesting, it's been 30 years or so since the Soviet Union fell. And speaking once to a Federation and Jewish establishment official here in New York City, she told me that they have a hard time integrating the Jews from the Soviet Union into kind of Jewish life in New York. That they remain very much separate and apart. And even though they're members of the Jewish community, they have their own needs. So I guess the question is, as Jews in this post-Soviet era, how do you think that experience continues to stay? So it's gone, families are out, everyone's here. How does the Jewish experience continue in uniquely, the Soviet affected by the trauma, as it were, today?
Or the positive.
Not positive and negative. I think I don't know, this is from my family, maybe it also extends to other people, but that we were raised, and those of us who remain continue to have just a deep, deep suspicion of anything that is institutional. They're, joining the club in the Soviet Union, being forced to be a pioneer. When you're a kid, you had to be a pioneer with the red scarf and serve the country, it just resulted in our parents anyway teaching us just to never really be part of something and be completely yourself. And to this day, I can see it in my own life. It really is that way. But the way, the way we as, like, I guess secular Jews, we always call ourselves bad Jews. And I know you don't like when I say that, but, like, that's my family, we call ourselves that within the false world. But, it's through, we do it how we can. It's like through holidays and through food and through caring about Jewish issues, caring about anti-Semitism, but, and also, there is the desire for religion, though, because I do think, like, you can see things fading away if you don't have, like, the traditions to actually continue them. So, for example, with my sister just had her first kid, and, they're raising her in, like, a really cool way more Jewish than anybody in my family that I remember, like, at least, great-great-grandparents going back, like, more Jewish than anybody's ever been raised. And partly as a way also for her to be connected to the Russian Jews that didn't have that in their lives, because it was like a means of talking about them. So, but they're doing it in, like, a very individualistic way, so we'll see.
I think that the weariness towards institutions is absolutely to give an anecdote when COVID was taken off in New York. The government said, don't wear masks. Everyone minded when writing was 40 masks. As soon as the government said, put on a mask, they stopped. Just like an instinctive kind of distrust of institutions, an instinctive kind of distrust of public life in any kind of way, because it was performative and it was a lie. It was not the thing that was the true life. People that you knew behind closed doors, people that you trusted, was very much engagement. Even engagement with Jewish life, I mentioned we looked at a lot for high holidays when I was a kid. It was not because my parents were, they knew everything about the teachings of the Rebbe and everything else. It was because, there was a conservative shul in town, and my parents went to we would like our son to have parties. They had no idea what this, but they, it was a thing. They wanted me to have one, and the shul said, "Great, you can become dues-paying members, and you have to show up for services on Shabbat." And they gave them the price for it, and my dad was, had a job where he was working 5 days a Saturday. We can't afford this. What's dues and what's Shabbat? Kind of thing. We ended up going to Chabad because Rabbi Dovid was a Russian speaker. He was, Soviet background. There were other people in the building who were Russian speakers. We linked them on the individual kind of level. That's still my parents' engagement with the religion to this day. It is the individuals that they have in trust, not institutions. For me, I don't have the same reflexive kind of distrust of institutions, but, there are other kinds of ways that, the Jewish community, the American Jewish community has a particular kind of narrative of, what happened with the Soviet Jewry, and it's one where they are the main character in the story. So when I was, in high school and in college, when I was in high school and in college, and engaging with, like, the local federation, or, like, with Hello and everything, I'd get trotted out in front of donors, where I was given the script and being told to thank these people for helping us get out of the Soviet Union. My father wasn't a cousin. Why am I thanking people who never went through it before? So you can understand why there's a kind of, alienation from these kinds of institutions where, even if I don't have a distinct kind of distrust of it, they have a very working understanding of who we are that, is us in relation to them rather than us on our own terms. So I think, it's a challenging kind of thing. I think it's dialed down for me over time as I've gotten more involved with Jewish life, as I've gotten to have a lot more observant friends, gotten used to what a Shabbat service is like. That's become easier over the years, but again, it's because if I go to a shul, I know people in it. It's not because, like, shul is a great place in it itself.
I go to shul for the same reason, actually, just for the record. Well, distrust of institutions is very real. I went to Russia this year with the group 10 days, I think, before the war started. We left we left on Sunday from our stuff,
And the war started Thursday, and it was like, the CIA is telling us that there's a war. Like, come on, this is obviously a whole setup. And it's not my fault that the CIA got something right for the first time in 50 years. Like, right, Graham? I know what it's supposed to be. But yeah, I think the institutional, my parents became religious. They were also refuseniks, and they started becoming religious in the refusenik circles. More interested, and they got I call it Gareth Fillin, still in the Soviet Union, which he left behind on his way out so that somebody else couldn't have that. But even as like they became more and more close to Chabad, he and I always respected him before this is that he never putting on the whole getup. Like it was a slow process. He studied it was always guard for like the belt. It was kind of a long process, then from the beer. So that was also just because we don't just buy into clubs, which again I see as a strength, just not just buying into some, something that's laid out for you. I think it's a wonderful thing, or could be wonderful. With Russian Jews also, so I had the other perspective where we went there and you're dealing with Russian-speaking Jews, etc. So you spend a lot of time. So one thing that maybe the federations are missing is alcohol. I don't know. maybe they have it, but they don't know how to do it. They're like here, drink. I don't know. But there's something there that I feel like we could probably sit down and drink together, and it will be a very nice, warm conversation. But yet, I think there's expecting certain American norms of Russian Jews where they don't know these things. So the dudes, there's all sorts of the whole federation structure. Whatever worked for somebody maybe, and for Russian Jews it never existed. And I think also just the fact that Russian Jews walk into a Hasidic synagogue and they're gonna see something that they might feel they're gonna see something that's more familiar to them than when they walk into a institutional reform. So that's my understanding from just because that's what they relate to in terms of what they do from their grandparents, and I think that's something that needs to be understood and but definitely tapped into. I think there needs to be more. I think it's pretty weird that we're here at 30 years after the Soviet Union. Like I never lived there at all, but I drink tea and eat shpraten, and I love this stuff very, very much. And I think that's something that that lives through other Soviet, post-Soviet Jews as well. The leadings that I get.
That makes me remind me of an anecdote. There was a Rabbi David Hollander. Yeah. Rabbi David Hollander was an Orthodox rabbi associated with kind of the greater university world, and he was on a very early trip to the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. 55. 55. Yeah, so it was a very, very early trip. At one point, they met a group of Karen Jews. So, basically, they didn't speak Yiddish or Hebrew, get around. Karen Jews, for some reason, they weren't able to speak them. Just know whether it's an all Ashkenazi town. But met Karen Jews, and they tried to say, or a group of these were, Talmudic scholars and state rabbis. They're all clean shaven as well. Karen didn't recognize them as rabbis. So they were like, you're not rabbis. And then they take out the tzitzis and show them that they were doing something to believe that they were actually had some religious clout. So in terms of this kind of when the Soviet Union perhaps think about Judaism in the past, everyone shed the book practice, to speak about force. I guess one final thing, and one up for conversation and questions about this conversation, but I guess the final takeaway you want to share from your own from your saying Soviet Jewish experience, yourself, your life. Just you want to share something positive. What to end on that?
Something positive. That's not my area of expertise. I think, and I hope that we can discuss this during questions or discussion. But I do think that the war in Ukraine is such a paradigm shift for the world and also for post-Soviet Jewry. So I hope we can talk about that if you guys want to. But I'll put that stuff aside for now. But something positive. My positive thing actually is that. I've been talking about the anti-institutional or anti-group or whatever you want to call it thing is a negative thing, but I do see it actually as having a real positive side. like when Putin came to power, there were a lot of people who were very hopeful. Despite what he did despite what he's perceived to have done for the Jewish community in Russia, mainly he kept them safe. So we'll give him that. It's not a small thing. But everybody that I knew was incredibly suspicious from the get-go, and I think getting that kind of like insight, and you talked about it as well, like in this time of chaos, to have some sort of paranoia is not bad. And I think, when I look back at like Soviet Jewry or post-Soviet Jewry, I do think a lot about the writers, the political activists, the people who were ringing the alarm from fairly early days, and left like an incredible legacy that it also ties into my Russian Jewish experience, be it, Brodsky or whoever. Like, that to me is like the positive side of things, I guess. It's still negative, that's a Russian Jewish thing.
For me, I think a lot of it's going to tie back to family. There is like a particular kind of social dynamic that I think is distinct to Russian Jews relative to other Jewish kinds of communities. I have found in a lot of ways where, children are not treated as children in Russian Jewish families. You're treated as like a small adult, and there's a lot of drawbacks to that. But there's also a lot of empowerment that comes with that. You are part of the decision-making of the family. It's not just your parents decide X, Y, and Z. Sometimes that your education, that you're playing an instrument is a parental decision, but like other kinds of family decisions, you're very much involved as a decision maker. Sociologists in American Israel have studied this parenting style that, for me was very empowering in terms of I was very comfortable in early adulthood making my own decisions and making decisions on pretty important things of, what kind of observance I want to be doing, where I want to be living, those kinds of things that I think a lot of people struggle with that transition, where I very much felt empowered as a result of it, that I think is very much rooted in the Soviet Jewish experience. And I don't think I would be sitting in front of you right now if I was not the kind of person who thought, well, I'm going to be out the often sharing my opinions in public, and that transforms into writing and public speaking and everything else.
But mouthing off at home with your parents sometimes doesn't, like at the table, like, what are you doing?
They're actually like a lot more comfortable with that. It's this stuff that they hate. They're like, do not share your opinions in public.
You don't know which one that anti-Semitism. So I think that to pick up on Miriam mentioned the writers, I think that's I recently read for the first time Life and Fate by Celia Grossman, which was a very moving experience.
1,000 pages.
Yeah, it took me a while.
Years.
Years. No, I thought, a year?
Years.
And no, I started it a few times, and then I stopped the Holocaust because it was like, I can't deal with it. And then, anyway, I ended up finishing the whole thing. It was very, very, but it's something that I've been, thinking about more recently was how that all ties together. How all these different Jewish experiences in the Soviet Union, the different Soviet Jewish experiences tie together, and it's something that tipped me off. My grandfather used to tell me he loved Yiddish, he loved the Yiddish poets. Itzhak Pfeffer and then Paritz Markish and Bergelsen. They were the ones who were arrested by the Night of the Murdered Poets. So he would tell me, you need to write about them. And then, he would bring me, the New Jersey Jewish Standard, and he'd be like, look, there's a bunch of good articles in here. And I'd be like, just take it, rewrite it a little bit yourself. It's simple stuff, but no one's going to know who's going to know. So, I would have these stacks of New Jersey Jewish Standard. But I never thought, I work for Curated. I write mostly on, religious Jewish topics, or, it's kind of like I didn't think that I would have any. He was telling me to write about the Night of the Murdered Poets for years, and I didn't know how I would ever get to do that. And then I was reading, so the Rebbe's mother wrote this diary. The Rebbe's mother was Rebbe Chana Schneerson. Her husband was Rabbi Lightstone. She was the rabbi of Yekaterinburg, Dinev Trust and Today Hebrew. Remained in his position very, very late, until 1939, through 1939, until Passover 1939, actually. He was arrested right before Passover. So she wrote a memoir, very, very simple but moving, kind of these different experiences, and she's reminded as she goes. She's like kind of current events. She wrote this when she came to America. So there's various current events that are taking place, and she's kind of reminding her of different episodes that she had lived through. So I guess 1948, 1949, probably early 1949. I think that's when Paris Markish was arrested. She's like, I just got word that Paris Markish, the famous Soviet Yiddish poet, was arrested, and that reminds me, and taken to who knows where, and that reminds me of the story. She writes a story about how Paris Markish, in 1938, Paris Markish came to, Paris Markish's father lived in the National Trust. And he was a religious Jew, was part of the synagogue, through the 30s. It's a pretty dangerous time, obviously. Died in 1938, and Paris Markish basically sent word to the rabbi that came now from Moscow. His father passed away, and he wants, I've heard much about you, Rabbi Schneerson, and I want you to take care of the funeral in the way you need to do that, which is a very great undertaking in 1938 in the Soviet Union. At the height of the Great Terror. Left money, anyway, paid for it. He said, I can't be seen with you, or, I can't be anywhere near you. Schneerson itself was a dangerous last name by that point. And and when he left money for the underground cadres, the underground schools and whatever underground shit that was going on. So that's really the entire story. And I found it back, for me, it was like these worlds collide, right? So I'm coming from a certain Soviet Jewish background where, I find somebody spoke Yiddish, somebody did, but I have religious Jews back until who knows when. And then when Chabad, you encounter kind of people who went through this entire, a very amazing story. It was one that I'm fascinated with, people who went through this whole, generations, religious through the 30s, through the 40s, through the 50s, through this, there's a religious community in Samarkand until through the 70s. I mean, that we tell that to people, it's mind-boggling. And you speak to them, and it's a very, it's a very interesting experience, but it will always seem to be as two different worlds. And this story kind of opened up my eyes, and now I see it more often, much more frequently in columns and everything, where it's really one story, right? Like the same way that Jewish people are really one people, we say this as a cliche, but it really is true. First of all, these people related to each other, and everyone knew each other, and so we look at everything in a very kind of black and white way, and it's not really like that. And so like the kind of the Soviet Jewish experience is very illustrative of that, especially when you go beyond that. It's one Jewish people, and it's one, and you kind of start seeing the same soul coming out in all these different ways. And to me, I wrote an article about Paris Markish and Rabbi Yitzchak. And my grandfather, I don't know if you read it, but he's like, great, you made money. But one thing that was fascinating to me was that Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, the Rebbe's father, his yard site, the day he passed away, the 20th of the month of Av. And he passed away in exile in Kazakhstan, where he's buried. I was looking at Wolfram Alpha to figure out when was the night of the murdered poets. And I looked up, it's the 21st of Av, 1952, when they were all shot. Yeah, it's one day off. It would have been amazing. It's the same day, but that's just as a kicker. But still, one day off. I thought it was to me that was an amazing thing to be able to see, like how intertwined all these stories.
I'd like to think.
This is a long story coming.
I'd like to thank you guys. I'd like to open up to the audience as well. Please say your name and then what you'd like to ask or share.
I left Soviet Union when I was 15 years. So my first 15 years, I never knew what it was. And most Jews of the last generation were notified. They were informed about who they were, that they were Jews, when they played outside with other kids. And then they could go home and ask their parents what happened. These kids are called with bad names. Yes, exactly. what if they're calling me a bad name? What does it mean? What does that word mean? What does it mean, right? And what does it mean? The parent would be prompted to explain to the child, oh honey, this is not a bad word. These are, it means Jew, and this is us. And that word is being called, this is us, and you should be proud. So there's a schizophrenia that I think that Soviet Jewry can really define as in so many ways. Going back to your second question of integrating Soviet Jewry into Yiddishkeit. Ironically, the Jews that I found that were part of the Soviet institution integrated much easier into the institution from Jewry to there. I have often, again, it's a generational thing. Generation of my parents born in 1940s. 1940s, 1950s, blended in much easier. The ones who did not have, my parents were refusing, but the ones who were born and grew up in the Soviet Union, part of the Soviet sort of institution, and participated in that institution, specifically blended into a lot really well. Because of so much, I have found, I think the Rebbe perhaps took the best from the Soviet institutions, such as Tzivas Hashem, the army, the parades, celebration of birthdays, which is a very strange tradition. Americans don't really. It's not. But it's a really interesting thing. And we were saying the question of where Russian Soviet Jews when they say from Moscow. Second question, where are you from? Moscow. Because it's a status thing. When you mentioned the streets, I knew exactly that you come from a family of old Bolsheviks. I knew exactly. I'm like, yeah, this is 100%. And it's an interesting. That's why I'm like, when they ask and when they tell me what street they're from, I'm like, got it. I can write it with my hand. But it's also a generational thing because my two sets of grandparents, one set of grandparents. They grew up in Schnell. And they grew up, they're from Austria, I'm sure. School communities. But they grew up with Yiddishkeit. And it was just part of their life. We didn't know about it, but they what is the grandpa saying? Like, his uncle told me, grandparents. They just kind of kept it quiet, but say my other set of grandparents, they grew up with the Yiddish culture. When I was Yiddishized, when Jews were sort of, it was okay to be Yiddish, but not Jewish. So much to say, it's a very pleasure to
about Yiddish culture. There was a Soviet, what's the name of the, Soviet Shame Month. There was a Soviet Yiddish magazine, news magazine, not news magazine, a literary magazine that came out, I don't know, again, coming out, I think in the 60s and 60s, something like that, when Yiddish was all of a sudden real loud. When the writers were all destroyed, it was gone. Yiddish was disappeared. And then, mid-60s, I think it was when it was allowed, and Soviet Shame Month came out. So Isaac Bashev Singer has this beautiful, very, very, cutting review of it in commentary. And he writes how basically, I wish I could quote it by heart, but stripped of the Yiddish, because, they also did the orthography, so they changed they took out the Hebrew from it. It says when Yiddish is removed from its Jewish culture, then from its Judaism culture, when it's removed from Judaism, it's removed from its roots as a Jewish language. It becomes what its its antagonists, they call it jargon. They say that it's a fake language, then that's when it becomes a fake language. You remove it from its Jewish roots, which it ended. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I was hoping that you could talk a bit more about the effect of the Ukraine war on all this stuff. And also, for all three of you, I've traveled Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries before and read a bit of Russian literature and followed the news. And the Ukraine war is still deeply baffling to me, even like 7 or 8 months into it. And I'm wondering if post-Soviet Jews or people with a Soviet Jewish background kind of can understand it in a way different from the rest of us might, levels there might be like me.
So what I took from my, Soviet Jewish parents is to just constantly operate with the deepest mistrust of the state and the Russian state in particular. And it doesn't actually, until there's a full reckoning with its history, it almost doesn't matter who's the head of it. But particularly that Putin is like a former KGB guy, it was like from day one, you cannot trust this man. So when I was reporting in Russia, and it was something that I would get criticized for sometimes by other reporters who were there, by some readers, that like I was Russophobic or whatever, because I just take a very pessimistic view. Always took a very pessimistic view of Putin and to the state in general. Again, a state that doesn't deal with its history. So just assume the worst and you'll be right. Has treated me well, for the past 20 years that I've been covering Russia. But in terms of, I think Alex has some interesting thoughts too, as a Ukrainian Jew, on how the war has changed Jewish identity in the region. It applies to Judaism. I think it applies to also other cultures, but I'm here to talk about Judaism. That even, I was thinking about it when I was like sharing the thing for the flyer or what have you for the event tonight, that like even the term post-Soviet has become incredibly problematic, for Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Uzbek, Lithuanians, Estonians, whatever, that this is all a function of empire, that this is a hopefully a post-colonialist sort of war, and that to separate from the Russian Empire and to not give the Russian Empire any power, you really have to re-own the identities of the particular nations that you're talking about. I think with Judaism, it's complicated. We were talking a little bit before the event started. Like for me, I consider myself Russian Jewish. My grandmother's whole family is from Belarus. There's no part of me that considers myself a Belarusian Jew because the stories weren't passed down in that way, even though I know the shtetl that she's from. So it's a thing that's in process. But I can say again, Alex probably has a lot more interesting things to say about this, but it's happening with all my post-Soviet, I use that in Godvinshkuf, I don't want to actually use the term anymore, I guess, but it's happening to all the identities, but particularly to Ukrainian Jews who just, will just not use the term.
Ex-Soviet is being more fun these days. Also fits me.
But also not great. Like the Baltic states were always pushing back against former Soviet republic, saying, we're so much more than just who colonized us.
And they were later additions to it. The thing that I would say on that is people this year suddenly become very interested in the opinions of people of our background, where it was not necessarily the case before now, or not as much. And I would caution on saying, what do Jews from countries of the Soviet Empire think about things? So I would draw a very big distinction between what we left think about things that people stayed. My parents do not refer to themselves as Belarusian or as Soviets or any of that. They are Jews, simply. They do not associate with these places. They have very bitter memories from these places, and it's not their world anymore. There are a lot of Jews who stayed. Before the war started, something like 250,000 Jews or broader Jewish community in Ukraine, terrible numbers in Russia, a lot smaller in Belarus, most of us left. But they still exist. There are people who are living a Jewish life. There are people living and observing Jewish life in these places who have an experience that is 30 years outside of Soviet rule. They have a very different kind of understanding of it. When the war started in Ukraine, it's important to remember it didn't start this year, it started in 2015, right?
there were people who I knew from Israel who had served in the IDF, very, fluent Hebrew speakers integrated into the society. When that war started, or going back home, going back to Ukraine and referring to it as home. They think that I could not wrap my head around. I did not understand what was going on. I would go and fight for this place that hated you so much. I still kind of struggle with it in a lot of ways, but you have, especially in the context of this broader war that started this year, I have family members who are in Ukraine who chose not to leave. They chose to stay. They chose to fight. I cannot really wrap my head around that kind of decision. I do not relate to these places in this kind of way. It's like, yes, we have a cultural kind of experience. I'm not going to go fight and die for any of these countries. That's not my home. They have a very different kind of view of it. The fact that Ukraine elected a Jew to be leader of their country is something that is also very difficult to understand. Ukraine evolved in a different kind of way after the Soviet era. Yes, there's a lot of problems there. It's not to say that it's easy to be a Jew there now and all the problems have been washed away, but there's clearly a different kind of Jewish experience than one that our parents went through in the Soviet Union. That I think it's a very interesting, dynamic kind of time there, and observing on the other side of it, the community that I can speak to, there was a lot of ambivalence when the war started. This is going to be a small scale thing. It's not that big of a deal. This is a bunch of huffing and puffing. This is a lot of news trying to get people's attention. It's not going to be a real war. That changed very rapidly when the war actually started. When people I knew here were talking to their family members there. And it's a difficult thing. I mentioned I have family in Ukraine. I also have family in Belarus, which is co-belligerent to this war. I have family in Moscow who I'm afraid to talk to them about the news because I don't know what their opinions are. I also don't know who's listening. And so you don't really have a good sense of what's going on. So it's a complicated time.
As we get to talking about all these things that I don't have to comment on, let's just focus on one. I think that Jews have the ability to add a little bit of nuance, to let's say sorely missed nuance. You have, from the beginning of this war, obviously, us flying a few days after the war started, and watching CNN on the plane, and poor guys trying to pronounce the cargo. He has no idea where the hell it is on the map, and it was completely fish out of water. They don't know what they're talking about, but they just have to talk about it. So they're Kharkiv is actually, he somehow says Zaporozhye, and it was horrible. I don't remember what it was, but it was something atrocious. The Jews, so around that time, he asked me, I said, cargo, but back then many times, and so I was talking about it a lot. Somebody asked me, so when we say cargo, are the Jews more ethnically Ukrainian or ethnically Russian? They're ethnically Jews. They're not. So I think that's where you're right. Post-Soviet doesn't maybe make sense anymore. Russian speaking could make sense, more sense. Historically, Jews were always a Rus-flying factor. They used Jews in various places as a Rus-flying factor because we didn't. We would rather stick with the empire instead of the local nationalists because we had, got some pickles with them, and it wasn't, it didn't overall. So I think to be able to be around to temper the conversation, to say calm down, Zelensky wasn't brave, or whatever, these different, again, and from the Russian side, you have plenty to say about everybody, and just everybody get off their high horse. I think that there's a really important ability to say that. It is very tragic, meaning I don't. My parents from Russia, my grandfather was from Ukraine, and the other side is really from the Shekels in Belarus. I never thought, Ukrainian Jew or Belarusian, but it is true that it has evolved to the point where there is such a thing as Ukrainian Jew, and it didn't really exist at all. Although that is a very, I think it's 2014 and all. It wasn't, I don't think that existed for that. And at times it's painful now, when you see kind of the difference between Jews were there, Jews were there, they're whatever, they live in a different reality than we do. But overall, we still have the ability to be able to kind of to do this tempering together.
Going off that and gives the comments you asked of the Soviet Jewish mindset, Soviet Jewish political onset, I was wondering if you could comment on what the Soviet Jewish political contribution has been so far in America, but also in Israel as well, and maybe what we can expect with the next generation as well.
Great topic. Listen, in America, where Jews are already a small part of the population, Russian-speaking Jewry is a smaller one. I think I'm aware of 2 elected officials who are Russian-speaking Jews in the entire country. I don't know that there's been, a notable push of it. Frankly, most of the people I know, from my background are not in politics because these are people who are, financially establishing themselves generally, this country, the rich man's game, right? So, generally speaking, there are exceptions. In Israel, a lot more Jews from the Soviet Union came there, right? Something on the order of, depending on how you count, 900,000 to 1.5 million came through. You have, if Russian-speaking Jews were voting as a bloc, they'd be something like 60% of the seats in the Knesset. They don't vote as a bloc, like every other kind of community, they're not monolithic. You have, Russian-speaking members of labor, and you have an entire standalone Russian-speaking party, and you have my family members who are diehard Hindus. Like, that's just the way that it goes. I think the contribution has been that they've, in many ways, assimilated. In the 90s, people kind of forget this, and I have to bring this up a lot. When Rabin came to power, he did it with the vote of Soviet Jews. I was the person they knew. He was a general. He was a respected figure. That was the name that they gave the Soviet Union, and it was demonized once, and they respected me for it. Going back to anti-institutionalized times. Going through the 90s and suicide bombings and the Intifada and everything, the community that transformed right alongside the rest of the country, where there is a lot more skepticism of the possibilities of what can be done. It is a much more harsh kind of view. My mom's whole family was there, and I talked to them about this time. It's just we can have the conversation because we are doing it in Russian, but there is a kind of, the broader kind of growing disconnect between American and Israeli Jews that happens that I think it would be worthwhile for people to be talking to immigrants who had no idea what the conflict was, who never heard of a Palestinian or an occupation or anything like that until they got to it, to be living it, dealing with the violence of it in their day-to-day lives, and how they understand the world. But their contribution, I think, has been pretty much more notable in Israeli politics. There's been multiple Russian parties. Lieberman is still an active figure in Israeli politics. Interesting to see what he does in the upcoming election. But yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic. Also, I find it super fascinating that they do not do block voting in any kind of way, because I think that there's a lot of interesting coalitions you can have by the secular and national sensibilities of rights and issues in Israel. Hope that answers your question. I read about this in a lot more often, so.
Hi, my name's Rafa. I work at the Lubavitcher Hotel. Thank you, Rabbi Lightstone, for putting together this fascinating panel. It's really, really interesting to hear, especially as someone who grew up in New York, and I met Russian Jews over the years, but I never really understood the perspective and what it was like to be a Jew in Russia. And the idea of being singled out as a minority, like in New York, everyone's a minority. We spend the whole day in the classroom, we had to point out who was a minority. So with that being said, when your families came over to America, were they surprised by how much Jewish culture was featured in mass media, and did that have any cathartic effect for them going back to Russia as a Jew, or like just being a Jew in society here? Did it like reframe how they thought people felt about Jewish culture?
I'll say that I won't generalize. My parents, my mother in particular, coming over here, I think, and feeling safe, and she did feel safe here. She passed away 4 years ago, so a lot is things are constantly changing. So definitely, things sort of changed towards the end there. But her her love for America knew no bounds. She was obsessed with this place. And also, like, later in life, also, like, developed, even though she was never able to visit, developed, like, a huge connection to Israel and was giving money, you know, up until, like, the end of her life. The representation and culture was really important to her, but again, like, there were ways to find that within, like, Russian culture as well.
Like, there are so many shows who, like, the main characters are clearly very, very Jewish. There's so many people. Were they surprised by that?
Was she surprised by it? I don't know if, like, surprise is the word that I would use for her in particular. It really was just, like, love and gratitude. She, you know, I guess it's like, it can be a common immigrant experience if you've made it to a place where you can feel, like, safe and comfortable in a country. She just was filled with, love and gratitude. But I don't remember her talking about that, like, specifically, although, like, anytime, you know, Fiddler on the Roof was, like, being performed, she would be first in line and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it was definitely, she tried to make it as much a part of her life as possible, definitely, and, like, you know, would not flip past a Seinfeld rerun, not get her to do it. It was something that didn't exist in that form in Russia, and I think doesn't really even exist. Well, you had some comedians. You had comedians who maybe, like, they'd somewhat talk about their Judaism a little bit, but that was probably, like, Shvanetsky, like, was probably, like, the Soviet Jewish comedian, but other than that, you know, it was really, like, in terms of literature and poetry, Life and Fate was her favorite book by far, and then here maybe it was more like a popular culture thing. I think that's what brought her so much happiness, is that it didn't only have to be sort of dark, and it also didn't have to be private, because so you had to consume good culture in the Soviet Union, you had to consume so much of it privately because it wasn't, you know, allowed. And so the joy of just having it be like a musical or a TV show is definitely big.
In my family, I think there was similar kinds of dynamics of a lot of love and admiration for the U.S. Like, I have a very distinct memory of the first time we walked into a grocery store in the U.S. and my mother just seeing fresh fruit, fully stocked, and just, like, gushing with it. Like, we will still go to, like, the store. My mom will still comment on this, you know, years and years later. It's just like a huge impression. The cultural component of it, I think there was not a whole lot of interest in, you know, those things. My dad liked Seinfeld, but, like, because it was funny, not because it, you know, was, like, an overtly Jewish kind of thing. The way that I engaged with American culture when I was a kid was my parents would make me read the classics of American literature, which meant reading 19th century American lit, which had a completely different vocabulary, and I did not understand why everybody in Tom Sawyer was licking each other. But they were going at it from, like, a very Soviet mindset of, like, these are the classics of the culture. They would put on TV, and I would have to watch TV and repeat what they were saying on TV so that I could speak the way that I do now without an accent. Right? There was not the same kind of interest in it. Like, real culture, real literature for them was the Russian Soviet classics. I mean, grew up on Tolstoy, on Chekhov. That's culture to them. You know, learning an instrument was like a big battle. Like, there's not particularly interest in piano or violin. Well, you have to learn an instrument. You have to have culture. So the compromise we had was that I learned to play saxophone. Like, that's popular in America. It's fine. Like, the interest in American pop culture was never particularly there. I don't think it still is even now. Like, my parents,
your mom will let you know when she finds out if an actor is Jewish.
Yes, that's true. That's, like, the extent of, like, their interest is, like, the people who are involved. Like, when we went to go see Dune, my mom was very determined. Like, my mom went with us, it's my wife speaking, that Timothy Chalamet was a Jew.
What?
Yeah. Sure. So, like, look at more than that. Yeah. So we went and looked it up. My mom was correct. He is Jewish. But, like, that's
French. Walking around and pointing out that he's Jewish, 100%. I would if I would see him. I would ask him.
But yeah, like, there was not the same kind of interest in it. There's also, like, you know, my wife's family is very interested in, like, Broadway and everything else, and my parents have, like, a very distinct Soviet sensibility of, like, that's like a middle or lowbrow kind of thing. True art is like going to the opera kind of thing. We never did. So
I feel like looking down at lowbrow stuff is, like, very common. Like, I cannot read a magazine that's not, like, Yeah, I can't read anything without first of all feeling deep guilt and shame. Like, let's say, I can't in the read a Reader's Digest. I'm sure it's fine. I can't not read it. Like, it's not my wife's books. Whatever. The novels, whatever that you take, you throw it out, whatever. I can't touch it. It has to be something.
My parents hated my love of comic books when I was a kid.
Oh my god! I was allowed to bring it to the house.
Yeah, absolutely. I was only allowed to read it at the store. That was our engagement with culture. I get made fun of all the time by American friends. What do you mean you don't know this thing? And I'm like, I don't know. It was not in our house growing up. Pre-2005, I don't really know American culture. So,
Devin, I think you should mention about the fact that if you want to read a book that wasn't classic, your father would maybe read classic.
I'm very happy. I'm actually I think that more parents should force their kids to read good books. So we end up on that. No, you have to read. I was given also, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, in 4th grade or something. I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but you got to read that stuff. So, I'm happy for it.
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm the child of Soviet immigrants. 1979, I came over from Belarus, and
where in Belarus?
Minsk.
Okay.
Yeah.
And before Minsk.
Before Minsk. My grandma was born in Zheldin, which is good. So very good for with kebab. I wanted to make this positive again. So because there's a lot of negativity and there's a lot of trauma. I mean, what can I say? But I feel like if you play your cards right, Soviet emigres will actually be positive. They'll tell you sometimes gushingly positive stories of coexistence with non-Jews. I was sitting with a friend of ours who is he's in his late 70s. He's a Ukrainian Jew, and we were reading Selyotka, and he started telling me where in Ukraine the non-Jews grew up speaking Yiddish and defending Jews, beating you up if you said something anti-Semitic. And I was very interested in hearing that, surprised about that, and in my family. My mom always told me that, everyone hated her because she looks Jewish, and, she would just be, she would just hear anti-Semitism on a daily basis. But, other people in my family would actually say, they would actually sort of speak highly of Belarusians, how they're sort of polite and kind. And some other people would say that there was actually quite a lot of coexistence between Christians and Jews, maybe before the Soviet Union. I don't know. Obviously, there was pogroms, too.
In terms of, I think in my family personally, there's a lot of there's a lot of fun stories, a lot of I grew up hearing stories about my parents' childhood, my grandparents, the family stories, but there is not one bit of missing the Soviet Union in the least bit, from anywhere, my mother, my father, my grandmother hated it. My grandmother, when I was going to visit when she was alive, I went back to Moscow. I went to Moscow and I went to her apartment building, where she was interested in seeing pictures, but she had not even not even an iota of missing that place at all. My grandfather, when I went to Kharkov for the year, he kept on calling me to tell me I need to leave that Svinyachi Hutor, right? which I don't even know how that translated to pigsty. Yeah, is it? Yeah, whatever. Right. I mean, it was constant barrage of now you're good, don't go back there. When I came by here, it was we're done, we're out, and we're good. And so that's. I mean, I don't know that it's so negative.
Negative,
it's not always negative. Sure, yeah.
People have personal relationships.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know if you, I mean, it sounds like you don't have that kind of in your family. You don't.
I don't know that they were the stories that I was told. I can give you one.
I can give you one.
Sure.
So my mom had two close friends growing up who she described as non-Jewish. Incidentally, one of them is actually blatantly Jewish.
Right.
On her paperwork in Russian, right?
Right.
The other one who remained in Belarus, when I was growing up, they still remain, like, we would buy like these cards and to like call like overseas and everything else. It's like a thing that is impossible to explain to anyone now.
Right.
But like we would do these things, like maintain these connections. And she had a son my age too, and we would do like all these care packages and everything else, and we maintain these relationships. My mom still talks to these people.
Right.
30 years after we left. There are definitely positive interpersonal relationships, but they're personal relationships that's not like a public kind of affinity like Jews and Italians in New York kind of thing.
Right.
So I think one more.
Thank you so much. This has been great. I wanted to ask like more specifically about you guys, each of you specifically, as opposed to speaking generally about like the ex-Soviet Jewish community. Has your identity evolved basically since the start of this war in Ukraine? Have you rethought in any way your identity? And I'd also like to add, in terms of the future, because we've been talking a lot about the past and perhaps the present. In terms of the future, what role does this identity have? Whether you're thinking about kids or even not, if you're thinking just generally about this community, does it exist? Is there utility to passing on a sense of this sort of identity, or is there not? Because I think there's a lot of debate around that second point.
I can start on the second point. Like for me, and I know that this term is like not generally applied maybe to this subject, but I think about it like in terms of intersectionality really. Like I don't feel like personally I, like to the next generation, have a choice of like passing on Jewish or Russian Jewish identity. All I have is my Russian Jewish identity. So for me to talk to the next generation, I personally have no interest in kids, but through my niece and whoever follows her, it is the literature. It's also the gefilte fish. It's everything all together. So I personally, in my identity, don't really feel like I have a choice. For me, my Judaism can never be separate from people arguing in Russian around a kitchen table. It's the beginning and end, really, of the identity for me, with a whole lot of mess squished into the middle. I think your first question is really interesting. I mean, I don't really have an answer. I think that all of us who have some connection, and there are probably many in this room, like all of us who have some connection to that part of the world are questioning everything on a daily basis, because while the war might be receding from the headlines now and again, for those of us who have, anyone who has a connection personally, professionally, whatever, like it's still front of mind all the time. So I don't have a concrete answer. It's a process, but yes. And then, for me, like one of my dreams is always like going and discovering like the more Belarusian side, I guess, or the Jewish side in Belarus of my family. And I hope that, I don't know, I just live with like the daily hope that one day the people there will actually live in some sort of freedom that also allows us to travel there and like meet family or friends, in a way that is not as horrific as it is right now.
Me too. Has Ukraine impacted my identity and my own personal Jewish journey? The war in Ukraine, I don't think, has impacted my self-understanding so much as my understanding of the region, as I mentioned before, of not really understanding why Jews would stay in these places, not understanding why they would run for office in these countries, why they would serve in the military here. I ended up having to challenge my own narratives about how I understood these places, and B, going back and doing like a lot of reading. I was not aware that there were like anarchist movements in Ukraine there who were not only sympathetic to Jews, actively committing acts of violence to protect Jews. That's an interesting piece of history that you don't really hear about when you hear about all the pogroms, when you hear about Stepan Bandera and all the collaborationists during the war. That it's a dynamic place, and it's not just one thing. Like any other country, it contains multitudes, right? And I think it's been very eye-opening to see that A, narratives can evolve, but B, countries can be more than their narratives. And I think that Ukraine has been pleasantly surprising on that front in a lot of ways. In terms of like what the Soviet Jewish identity means. For me, I've written a little bit about this. I would like to write about it in more depth. The upbringing that I have is not Soviet so much as Soviet immigrant in the U.S. Right, where I grew up around Russian speakers from the Soviet Union. When I grew up here, I grew up going to the international supermarkets in Brighton and then in Fair Lawn, where I'm eating the same foods that my parents were eating, growing up with the same kinds of ice creams, all that kind of stuff, all the things that I knew that's my experience. The media I grew up on was Chipurashka and
No Pogodi,
Galveston, all of these things, Soviet kinds of experiences, but set in the United States and with a shared experience with friends who were all that kind of background. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? That's a moment in time kind of thing. It is not, to me, a sustainable kind of identity. You can only go on for so long before we suffered, and also we appreciate some Soviet animation from the 1960s. I don't view it as a sustainable kind of identity generationally. I don't think that 2 generations from now there's going to be a distinctly Soviet or Russian-speaking kind of Jewish community in the States. It's not the first time that Jews have come over by the millions speaking Russian and Yiddish, and then that no longer being the lingua franca or the point of reference even. I think American culture is too enticing, too appealing, and too powerful. If you go anywhere in the world, people are watching Disney films and everything else and playing American music, and it is too powerful and all-consuming in a way to say that a dead empire's culture for a specific point in time is going to be something different. For me, what that meant was, the Jewish part of it is still very important to me. And yes, I love Russian lit and everything else, and I intend to be passing it down. And to the extent that the language is a component, I think I would like to be too, although I definitely need to brush up on my Russian lessons. My grammar is garbage. But it is in the context of, I want future children, if we are blessed to have them, to have an understanding of what this meant, what this experience was, with an understanding of they're going to have their own experiences, they're going to live their own lives, and they're not going to be in a setting where everybody is a Russian speaker, where you are having, some salt and some churnik chleb, big fat, keep it kosher home. It's not a thing that we're doing anymore. That it's just going to be a different kind of experience. But I think that I hope that the memory of it means something to me.
I'm in terms of passing it on to the next generation. I feel very happy and privileged that I live within the Chabad community, and the Russian Jewish identity in general, the Soviet Jewish identity in particular, is very, very intertwined with what identity of a Lubavitcher is, and so. For me, first of all, looking at history and with the interest in history that I have, it's basically all that I speak about anyway. And these are the stories that I read to kids at night. Could be simplifying what I worked on, or just taking books, but the Soviet Jewish story, and obviously specifically the self-sacrifice under fire, whether it's other people's stories or whether it's even those individual sparks of parents' dacha was raided by the KGB over Jewish materials, in the 80s. And it's a story that I tell them, we're walking to shul on Friday nights, I tell them that story, and they remember actually details and asking about it. And so those are things that I definitely want them to have, and I think that everyone, to some degree, should be educated about it, but it's very much their story. And because within Chabad, it's not a Russian speaking, but it is a Russian influence. My father-in-law is from Israel. His parents came from Russia, but my father-in-law, half of his Yiddish is really Russian. So it's how you say ceiling in Yiddish? I don't know. But anyway, so it's very ingrained. So I'm, very happy for that. I'm very for passing that on, and I'll do it without pressure. But this is what I feel. And it kind of happened with me also. I think that certainly with me, there was a point of time when you're like, 12, 11, whatever, like kind of in elementary school, and you're not so interested in the whole Russian thing, right? Whatever, like I speak Russian at home, but it wasn't, I wasn't particularly into it. And then as I got older, right, I got into it, and then I went there and I got even more into it. Now, like I feel more at home within that kind of setting, and that could happen to my kids as well. To the first part about changing identity, the Ukraine one in particular, I think Alex's point was very, very interesting, and I would say for just on a very simple level, Ukraine itself, I do think that it's a very interesting and inspiring story that Ukrainians who were not historically Jewish, you can find pockets of interesting tidbits and stories, but overall, and certainly in Jewish memory and Jewish thought, the Ukrainians were not the friends of the Jews. That's it, like period, end point. Until World War II, there was two big evil people, Denikin and Petlura. Denikin's a Russian, Petlura was the Ukrainian, but they hated it. Whether you can get into all the details of what he knew and who did what, where, but that's in the Jewish mind. And anti-Semitism was a part of the Ukraine, whatever. It's definitely a part of that story. It's complicated, but it's there. And I do think that there's been this change, certainly since 2014, and even more, profound since then, where you do see kind of this nationalist identity, which has changed into something which is different, and where Jews do feel genuinely a part of this, and I think that's an amazing. I think we're seeing something which is amazing. I don't think that anyone thought that was ever possible. Go tell a Jew from the old generation, Jewish president of Ukraine and Ukrainians and Jewish Ukrainians, what even is that? And I think that's a fascinating thing, and I think it's inspiring.
The Ukrainian army that hosts its own kosher seders.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah. That being said, the war should end.
All right, I'd like to thank all of you very, very much for being here. We're going to Shana Tova with Shana coming up. For those of you who don't have a place, we have you get the RSVP, we have some upcoming events, a meal first night of Rosh Hashanah. That's this coming Sunday, so what do you think? And then Shofar and Tashlich on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the 27th, at the Botanic Garden. We're all going to go together, so everyone here is invited if you don't have other plans otherwise. And in terms of the TwelveX talk, we're hoping, I believe, tentatively, the end of October, Sophia Gross, who was the head of democracy and civic engagement for staff very recently, is going to be able to speak. I believe on the 26th, we're hammering out that date. Information will be forthcoming. We have email addresses. We'll be emailing you. So thank you all very much. There's some sushi left as well and some drinks. Thank you to the Lubavitcher Hotel for being amazing hosts.
Well done.